He should have died there. Instead, that wounded 15-year-old would spend the next 36 years crossing seas, serving emperors, fighting wars, surviving betrayals, and taking a kingdom for himself. But every life, no matter how extraordinary, has a final battlefield. England, September 25th, 1066. Beneath a cold and colorless sky, Harald Sigurdsson stood on an English field, surrounded by the wreckage of battle. He was no longer the wounded boy who had fled Stiklestad. He was 51 years old, a king, a veteran of wars fought thousands of miles from home. He had traveled from the frozen north to the Mediterranean world. He had fought in the service of powerful rulers, risen among the warriors of the Varangian Guard, survived political intrigue and exile, returned to Scandinavia, and eventually claimed the crown of Norway. For 36 years after Stiklestad, death had failed to keep him. In Russia, in Byzantium, across battlefields and seas, again and again, Harald had walked away. But England would be different. On this field, the long road that had begun with a wounded 15-year-old was approaching its end. So why had Harald crossed the North Sea and risked his kingdom, his army, and his life for the English crown? And how had the frightened boy who once fled Norway become a king feared across Europe? To understand that, we have to return where it all began, Norway, around the year 1015. Harald was born around the year 1015 into a powerful Norwegian family. His father, Sigurd Syr, was a wealthy chieftain. His mother, Åsta, was also the mother of King Olaf Haraldsson, the man later remembered as Saint Olaf. The brothers were separated by age, but united by ambition. Olaf had once ruled Norway. By 1030, however, the country had fallen under the power of Canute the Great, King of England, Denmark, and Norway. Olaf returned from exile to reclaim his throne. 15-year-old Harald joined him. At Stiklestad, their small army met a coalition of Norwegian farmers, chieftains, and warriors opposed to Olaf's return. This was not a simple battle between Norwegians and foreign invaders. Norwegians fought on both sides, divided by loyalty, religion, power, and old grievances. According to later saga tradition, Harald fought near his brother and was badly wounded. What is certain is that Olaf was killed, his army was shattered, and the teenage Harald became a fugitive. The battle gave Olaf a martyr's death and eventually a saint's crown. Harald received nothing but a wound and a lesson he would never forget. A royal name did not make a man king. Power had to be gathered, protected, and, when necessary, taken. Loyal followers carried Harald away from the battlefield. He hid in the Norwegian wilderness until his injuries began to heal. Then he crossed the mountains into Sweden and traveled east. Behind him lay his dead brother and a lost kingdom. Ahead of him lay a world far larger than any Norwegian battlefield. Harald found refuge in the lands of Yaroslav the Wise, ruler of Kievan Rus. The river cities of the east were not foreign to Norse travelers. For generations, Scandinavian merchants and warriors had followed these waterways toward the Black Sea and Constantinople. They traded furs, wax, amber, silver, and enslaved peoples. Some served princes, others founded families and never returned north. Yaroslav knew the value of experienced fighters, even very young ones with royal blood. Harald entered his service and, according to later accounts, took part in military campaigns in the region. Here the defeated prince began to rebuild himself. He learned that armies could be held together by more than family loyalty. Men followed silver, reputation, discipline, and the promise of victory. But Harald had not traveled east merely to survive. Beyond the Rus lands stood the richest city in the Christian world, a city the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City, Constantinople. Its emperor commanded professional armies and guarded palaces filled with gold. At the center of that imperial machine served an elite force of foreigners famed for loyalty and violence, the Varangian Guard. For an exiled prince with no kingdom, Constantinople offered exactly what Harald needed: war, wealth, and the chance to become something more dangerous than the boy who had fled Stiklestad. When Harald entered Constantinople, he entered a civilization of stone, gold, law, and ceremony, unlike anything in Scandinavia. The city's walls had resisted armies for centuries. Its markets drew merchants from across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Above them rose the dome of Hagia Sophia. Inside the imperial palace, emperors ruled through ritual, wealth, diplomacy, and carefully directed violence. Harald and his companions joined the Varangian Guard. The Varangians were foreign warriors in imperial service, many of them Scandinavians, and increasingly men from the Rus world. Their distance from Byzantine political families made them useful to the emperor. They were paid well, trusted in dangerous moments, and identified by the great axes they carried. Harald's exact rank and every detail of his service remain debated. Later Norse sagas magnified his exploits, while a near-contemporary Byzantine account confirms that a man identifiable as Harald served the empire, received honors, and was sent on campaigns. The broad outline is extraordinary enough. Harald fought around the Mediterranean and on the empire's frontiers. He may have campaigned against pirates and rebel strongholds in Asia Minor. In Sicily, he served during the attempt of the brilliant general George Maniakes to recover territory from Muslim rule. He later fought amid Byzantine struggles in southern Italy and against rebellion in the Balkans. This was warfare far beyond the world of a northern chieftain. He saw professional engineers undermine walls. He learned how commanders used deception, intelligence, fire, and starvation to defeat fortified cities. He served beside Greeks, Armenians, Normans, Slavs, and men from across the empire. The teenager who had charged into battle for his brother became an experienced officer. He also became rich. Imperial service brought salary, gifts, and a share of captured wealth. Harald reportedly sent much of his treasure north to Yaroslav for safekeeping. Skaldic poems associated with his lifetime celebrate his campaigns and success, although later storytellers added details that cannot always be verified. Then Constantinople was shaken by a struggle for the throne. Emperor Michael IV died in 1041. His successor, Michael V, was quickly overthrown after attempting to remove the powerful Empress Zoe. Riots filled the capital. The Varangian Guard stood close to the center of the crisis. The sagas place Harald dramatically inside these events, even claiming involvement in the blinding of the deposed emperor. Byzantine sources are less theatrical. They confirm his service and honors, but not every act later attributed to him. At some point, Harald was imprisoned or fell into danger at court. The reasons differ from source to source: disputed treasure, political suspicion, or conflict with imperial authority. Once again, he escaped. Later stories describe a daring flight from Constantinople, with Harald's ship crossing a harbor barrier as the empire tried to hold him. Whether that scene happened exactly as told is uncertain. What matters is what Harald carried away: years of military experience, a reputation known across the north, and enough gold to transform an exile into a contender for a crown.
Harald returned to the court of Yaroslav the Wise, no longer as a wounded boy seeking protection. He returned as a celebrated warrior with imperial gold. Around this period, Harald married Yaroslav's daughter Elisif, known in Norse tradition as Elis F. The marriage connected Harald to one of the most powerful ruling families in Eastern Europe. It also announced that he was again a prince with a future. In Norway, the political world had changed. Canute the Great was dead. His northern empire was breaking apart. Magnus the Good, the son of Harald's dead half-brother Olaf, had become King of Norway and also claimed Denmark. Magnus was Harald's nephew. He was also the man sitting on the throne Harald wanted. Harald sailed west carrying money, followers, and acclaim based on royal blood. He first allied with Magnus's enemies, increasing the pressure on the young king. But both men understood that a civil war could destroy what they hoped to rule. A bargain was reached in 1046. Magnus would share the Norwegian kingship. Harald would share his wealth. It was an agreement built not on affection, but on calculation. Less than a year later, Magnus died. Harald Sigurdsson, the fugitive of Stiklestad, the mercenary of the Rus, the Varangian of Constantinople, became the sole king of Norway. He had spent 16 years preparing for this moment. Now the harder task began: keeping the crown.
The name Hardrada was not a family name used as modern surnames are. It is an Old Norse epithet, commonly understood as hard ruler, stern in counsel, or hard in judgment. It suited the king Harald became. Norway was not a modern centralized state. Powerful regional families expected influence, independence, and reward. Harald had returned with foreign wealth and foreign experience, but he still had to force proud chieftains to accept royal authority. Later sagas describe a king who could be generous to loyal followers and merciless toward opposition. His struggle with the influential noble Einar Thambaskelthir ended in bloodshed. Such accounts were written long afterward and shaped as dramatic stories, yet they reflect a reign remembered for the concentration of royal power. Harald also ruled through more than violence.
In January 1066, Edward the Confessor died without an heir. The English council crowned Harald Godwinson, but two other rulers believed England belonged to them. Across the Channel, William of Normandy claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. In Norway, Harald Hardrada possessed an older Scandinavian claim. On its own, it may not have been enough to justify an invasion. Then came Tostig Godwinson, Harald's exiled brother, driven from Northumbria and determined to reclaim his position. Later Norse accounts dramatize their meeting, but its outcome is clear. Tostig offered intelligence, local connections, and the promise of English support. Harald offered a fleet and a lifetime of war.
For the Norwegian king, England was not another raid. It was the final crown, the chance to create the North Sea Empire he had failed to win in Denmark. Harald sailed with perhaps 300 ships and thousands of men. This was an army prepared to conquer a kingdom. On September 20th, the Norwegians defeated the northern English forces at Fulford. York submitted, hostages were promised, and Harald's campaign appeared to be unfolding perfectly. But England's new king had reacted with astonishing speed. Only 5 days after Fulford, Harald marched towards Stamford Bridge, expecting hostages, provisions, and submission. Part of his army remained with the fleet at Rickhall, and according to later accounts, many of his men had left their heavy mail behind. Then sunlight flashed on weapons beyond the River Derwent.
It was not the delegation from York. It was the army of England. On one side stood Harald Godwinson, fighting to preserve the crown he had just received. On the other stood Harald Hardrada, pursuing the final crown of his extraordinary life. What followed became the most famous battle connected to his name, and for many, the symbolic ending of the Viking Age. That battle deserves a story of its own. In the next video, Harald Hardrada and the Battle of Stamford Bridge.